PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. I'd like to take you through a variation of the Rossolimo, which is currently quite trendy. So here is the Rossolimo, bishop b5, and my recommendation in my Anti-Sicilians book and my Chessable course here is knight f6, because I think it's really important for black to develop quickly. If you haven't seen by now, that's the book. You'll find all the answers in there. And in the Chessable course, it's on sale at the moment, by the way. So knight f6, what's the point? Well, you can see that black is behind in development on the king's side. And so it's really important to solve that one quickly. Otherwise, white castles and can attack through the middle. So knight f6 forces white to make a decision about what to do with this e4 pawn. Now, historically, the most common move has been knight c3. But in the past couple of years, bishop takes c6 is really trending. Now, after d3, in the book and the course, my recommendation is simply g6 and bishop g7 for black, which I think is really solid. But you can play this in different ways, and that's what I want to look at here. So, in this game, we have Alekseenko against Andreikin. Now, this is a blitz game. It's interesting, when you start researching databases, you find that there are certain players that specialize in these systems. And Andreikin is a great exponent of this whole line with knight f6. And he's won some really nice games with it, including this one. So let's have a quick look. So knight d2. So black is developing very quickly, but one of the ideas of bringing the bishop out so early is because this knight wants to drop back in order to get in e5. So this is how the game went. Bishop h5, there's no need to exchange yet. Knight c4, so that prevents e5. But f6, Andreikin is determined to get in this move. And now e5. So this is a really solid setup. You can see those pawns on e5 and c5 really cramp white in the middle. Impossible to force through d4. The only thing is this knight, well, it did a good job of shifting out of the way, but actually it's in a poor position. So the trick here is, where can you put that knight? And it really wants to go here on e6. And basically, once the knight is on e6, then that solves black's problems completely. In fact, I think if we could play there in one move, I would just say that black has the advantage with the two bishops. And that knight hopping into d4, possibly f4. Lovely position for black. So let's see how Andreikin manages to achieve that. Okay, black might simply castle on the king's side, but no. We want to get in knight e6 as quickly as possible. Now, Alekseenko lashes out with g4. He wants to bring the knight to f5. But black can stop that. And then we can see that this move is really risky. And now black can simply take the initiative, because once the h-file opens, that is extremely uncomfortable for the king. f4. Well, strategically, I guess this is what white wants to do, but it leaves the king really exposed on this diagonal. And not to mention this file, so this is problematic. So Andreikin opens up. And now he takes on c4. I mean, one could just take on f4 and play knight e6, but he exchanges. He's seen an interesting idea. So if d takes c4, he just wants to check, and that's better for black, because this bishop can come out here, the knight will come here. Black's minor pieces are good, you have a space advantage with this pawn. So b takes c4. Again, I think it's possible just to take here, but knight e6 is really interesting So the knight reaches its dream destination, basically looking at these lovely squares. F5, an exchange, and knight F4. Very interesting. Andreikin just wants to open things up. And now the queen comes in very quickly. And bishop d6. So this is looking really perilous for white's king. So how should you play here? I mean, the computer says that white can hang on with queen d2, but honestly, for white to survive this would be a miracle. Queen g4 was played. Okay, maybe it's time for me to have a drink and you to have a think. What should black play in this position? Cheers. All right, ready. Castle's queenside. Well, I hope you got that one. I don't think it's too difficult. See, that's one of the reasons why Andreikin wanted to keep his king in the middle. Remains flexible. And in this position, this is, of course, a great move because rook number 2 is swinging over. So rook h1. Of course, for the moment, the knight can block. But queen c3, that really leaves white in desperate trouble because there's going to be a check here. Well, not to mention the pawn can be taken, but one of these moves is going to be decisive. An exchange. Rook f1, queen takes d2 check. Rook here, and this does not save white because of this check. Little deflection, and here white resigned. King's in check, and the knight is pinned, and when the king steps up, bishop takes knight, and black is a piece up, and that's the end of the show. Of course, the checks do nothing. The king is going to just crawl out to safety here. Well, what a crushing win. But I think the key things to remember about this whole variation are getting that pawn to e5 to clamp white in the middle, and then this knight is the key to the position. This needs to come to e6. Once it's at e6, then everything snaps into place for black, basically. Funny enough, the same two players played online a year later. Now, instead of knight c4, Alekseenko played g4 immediately, and then knight h4. So you can see he's left his king in the middle. And obviously that's more flexible. You know, once you play the pawn to g4, you don't necessarily want your king on g1, as we saw. But e5, so Andreikin follows the same strategy. And the queen hits the knight, so the knight comes to f5. And h5, so this is like a carbon copy of the previous game, but this is but it's different with the king on e1, because if black exchanges, then actually white will dominate the file, and that could be very good for white. But this is an interesting move. Queen a5. I mean, I don't know if this is necessary. One could play queen c7 and then castles queenside. But queen a5 is a very interesting move because the knight is pinned. Now, how is white going to get out of that pin? You know, you might want to play b3 and bishop b2, but that allows queen c3. So white played king e2. Well, now we know where to attack. You know, the king is staying in the middle. This knight came to b6. Still a very long way from that key d4 square. But watch what happens with this knight. It has quite a career. Remember, actually, e6 is the key square. And it looks at all these lovely positions. Knight e3. Castle's queenside. Okay, the king gets to, well, relative safety. And now watch what happens. Knight a8. Fantastic move. So that knight is on its way. And when it lands on e6, watch out. Okay, it's going to take some time to get there. It's still blocked. f6, bishop f7, and finally the knight emerges. And this is now not easy for white, with this knight landing here, possibly even coming to b5. That's another very interesting square, looking at c3 and d4. And of course, black would like to play bishop e6 and g6, and that pawn here could be in trouble. So the game went like this: knight g3, and black switched. He didn't put the knight on e6, but the bishop on e6. So obviously he wants to win the queen like this, and that's problematic for white. How do you defend that pawn? If the knight comes back, you can just shift it with g6. So Andreikin won a pawn, and well, black was basically better here. Also, the interesting manoeuvres where the knight continued with knight a6. So it still wasn't going to e6, but look where it ended up. b4. That's very uncomfortable for white. Looking at these two. And after knight takes d3, well, black was crashing in. So yeah, once again, we see that the key to the position is to play with e5 and then to reposition that knight to a good square. And this bishop, which looks rubbish, actually managed to come round via f7 to a really good square on e6. I think it's a fascinating variation. So hopefully that will give you a few ideas if your opponent captures on c6 very early. You can play with g6. That's my recommendation in the book and the course. But, well, as I mentioned in the book, you can also play bishop g4 at a very early stage and play in a slightly different way. Hope you enjoyed that. Remember, the book is on sale and the Chessable course is on sale for the holiday season. So I think until after the 1st of January. So do check that out if you want to buy it, the online course. Thanks for watching.